Okay, then we'll get started now. So, hello everyone. Welcome to our ICDC Winner Roleplay panel discussion. And today we'll be having a discussion about role plays for DECA and how to get good at them, testing tips, presentation tips, all of that stuff. So, joining us today, we have Owen Zhang. He is the 2023 Business Law and Ethics Team Decision Making ICDC winner. So, he's really, really good at his event. Um, and yeah, without further ado, Owen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Owen, like Aiden introduced. I'm a senior at Interlake High School, and my event was business law and ethics team decision making. But I also did a couple of different events before that.
Awesome. Would our panelists also like to introduce themselves?
Hello, my name is Romir. I'm currently in marketing management, team decision making.
I'm Josephine. I'm a sophomore and I'm currently doing hospitality. Oh no, hotel and lodging management.
I'm Arnav. I'm also a sophomore. I'm doing business service marketing.
I'm Uma Stanu. I am PBM director, but I'm doing finance operations research this year. In DECA in the past, I've done principles of business management.
Hi, I'm Siyona. I currently do personal financial literacy and I did principles of finance in freshman year.
Hi,
Awesome.
I'm James.
Yeah, go ahead.
But yeah, I did entrepreneurship my freshman year. I think my Zoom is like broken. It's on my sister's name for some reason. Sorry about that.
Awesome. Yeah, so first, Owen, just some background questions. How did you decide to choose your event?
Yeah, so it was kind of on a whim. So the year before I chose this event, so it was my first year doing this event. But the year before I did start a business plan and I did principles of business administration and management. Um, but then for the second year, I decided I wanted to do like a partner-based event. So I was just looking through the team decision making, and then me and my partner, we kind of just saw like business law and ethics, and we were like, hey, this sounds kind of cool. Like law seems kind of cool to learn. It turns out like there's not actually that much law involved in this event, but it was still pretty fun. So I don't think like we had a lot of planning going into it. I think the reasoning was literally just that it sounded cool.
Awesome. Yeah, that's definitely a great reason.
How
Um,
did you find your partner?
Well, we were really good friends, so we were just
Okay.
like, so it was my partner's first year, and it was my second year. I was just like, hey, you should join DECA, and then we were like, okay, why don't we just partner?
Oh,
Yeah,
awesome. Yeah, do you have any, other than DECA, do you have any other sort of business background?
yeah. So like the reason I joined DECA is because, so I don't know if you guys know about the IB program, but like at my school, I was in IB business management for 2 years, and then our teacher like advertised DECA a ton. And actually, at our school, you need to be in a business class already to join DECA, which is a little like restrictive, but it's because there's too many people interested. So I did take 2 years of that, which like covered a lot of basics of business and like finance and marketing. It wasn't like too in depth, like the class is not that hard, but it definitely gave me like introduction, and it's probably the reason like I was interested.
Awesome. Yeah, one more just out of complete curiosity. How big is Interlake DECA?
I don't know. I would say like a bit over 100, probably.
I see. Awesome. Then Siona, do you want to get going?
Yeah. So some of our first questions are about testing tips, and we kind of want to ask, how have you prepared for tests in the past, and specifically like when you won? How did you prepare specifically for the ICDC test, knowing that it's like a lot harder than the district and state tests too?
Yeah. Um, I think like pretty much the only way to prepare for the test is kind of to do past tests because sometimes like you read the event name, right? Like business law and ethics, but like the test isn't necessarily what you might expect. So I would like look up past tests. I think a lot of them are available online, but I think our school also had this like resource with a bunch of past tests, and I'm not sure how like our teachers found them, but there's like a lot of free online tests that me and my partner just like did over and over. And if you do like enough of these, like not even that many, if you just do like 5 or 6, you'll start noticing that questions start repeating, both like like actually repeating like it's the same exact word or like the logic is the exact same. So I think that like doing enough past tests just helps you get like a lot of the questions for free. Um, Other resources I used to study, honestly, it wasn't much. I just took like questions that I didn't understand on past tests and I searched them up. I don't think you really need like a textbook or a study guide, although like Quizlet was pretty helpful as well. And then in terms of the ICDC test versus the like state and like area tests, I'm not sure about for other events. Well, for the couple of events that I did, I think how it worked was that like for the area and state tests, the questions were mostly like common sense. Like they usually had like maybe a dozen or 2 dozen questions that required some like kind of niche business knowledge, but the rest was just like common sense. So if you studied like any sort of like finance or math or like business, you would be able to get it. And especially for my event, a lot of the questions are literally just like emotional intelligence, like how should you react if one of your clients gets really mad? And then 3 of the options are like nonsense, and the other one's like talk it out nicely. So I think a lot of it you can common sense. I will say that like for ICDC, there are some like I don't know how to describe it, but I feel like there are some concepts that in particular they just really like asking about. So I would just look at past tests and then see like keywords or concepts that they keep asking about. And there's probably like some questions that you won't be able to do if you haven't looked at past tests or studied that concept specifically. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's good to know. How about, do you have any tips on what to do if you're like stuck looking at a question, you don't know how to answer it, or like, for example, you don't know the vocabulary in the question? What are your tips on like how to answer them?
Yeah, okay. So this is kind of general test taking advice, but um I would say that like if you're really spending a lot of time on a question and you don't know how to do it, I would just skip the question and come back to it later. But also like it's probably best to put down a guess since it's multiple choice, right? So I would say that like usually you look through the answer choices and oftentimes some of them are nonsense. Um, like I would also say that if there's an option with a vocab word that you don't know, it's better not to choose that option because I just feel like it's higher risk and also like they sometimes try to throw in like really complicated words to get you to choose that option when in reality it's like completely unrelated, right? Like if you see a word and you think like this seems completely unrelated to my subject, I think you should just trust that gut feeling and assume that it's unrelated. And there's a chance that you'll be wrong, but I think that's probably the best way to approach it. I think like I think it's very unlikely that you're not going to be able to understand all of the, or even most of the answer choices, right? Most of it uses pretty common language. But if you're really stuck, I would just say try to choose an option that you're like at least somewhat familiar with, and then try to logic out the rest. Um, but there are also some questions that are really direct, right? Like if it's about a specific definition, and I think if you don't know the definition and you can't find any way to eliminate answer choices, then I think you kind of just have to guess and move on. Um, but I think there are also a lot of instances in business where terms are like pretty obvious, even if you've never learned them before. Like if you're asked like what a public good is, and then like there's 4 options, I feel like that's something you should be able to like give your best guess, even if you've never heard that term's specific definition. But yeah.
All right, so going off of that, I just had a quick question in there, which was, as we get so close to ICDC, what do you think would be a good kind of goal for our members to shoot for their score on the test? First to make finals and then to, win beyond that stage. I know, of course, it depends on how good your role play is. But if someone has, a strong enough role play, what do you think is like their kind of goal?
Ooh, okay. So I don't remember my exact score on the cluster exam, but I know it got higher and higher through like area state ICDC. I think the thing about the like role play is that it's a little bit uncontrollable. Like you could get a judge that just scores you really weirdly, and even though ICDC has this like I don't know how exactly it works, but they try to like adjust your score based on how mean your judge is,
Yeah.
based on like how high of a score they typically give out. But I would say that like there isn't a specific score you should aim for on the test, right? Like you should aim to score as high as possible because you should think of it as like the half of the competition that you have control over. I would say that you only have like 80% control over your role play, whereas you have essentially 100% control over your test. I think like if you want to make finals or like win, I think like shooting for 90 is definitely something you should be shooting for. And like I would say that on each test there's probably like 10 to 20 hard questions as well. So if you can get some of those and then just make sure you get the rest of them correct, I think it's a pretty good thing to aim for.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like doing well on your test is important enough where like it doesn't substitute for having a good role play, but you still can't make it on just a good role play and not a good enough test score. So like I totally agree with it's the part that you can control, work on it,
Yeah.
make sure it's not to the detriment of your total score.
It's,
So
yeah.
yeah. So moving to role play a little, when you like how do you like recommend that our members prepare for their actual thing? I've always told members, don't do the thing where you try to like memorize your performance indicators because that doesn't make sense. Like I always tell people just go through it and kind of think about how you would address each one. How did you actually approach studying and being ready for what you got on that day?
Yeah. So I think like so you don't know exactly like what your performance indicators will be, and you also don't know exactly what your prompt will be. Um, Studying before the role play, I think so me and my partner did do a couple of like practice role plays in front of teachers and like the DECA club in general. But I will say like one of the biggest things I think is learning how to like speak confidently and just like public speaking skills in general, because I think like your presentation to the judge is just as important as the content of what you're saying, right? And I agree with you that like you shouldn't just memorize the performance indicators. What we usually did like once we received the actual role play was just like come up with a road plan and make sure that we would hit every performance indicator. And I think one thing that we did, obviously I don't know like exactly what we did that helped, but I think one thing is like you can sometimes use some of the wording in the performance indicators to make it really clear to your judge that you're actually hitting them. Like literally take part of the performance indicator and just repeat it in the context of some other sentence or while you're explaining. Because I think sometimes it's really easy for them to miss something. And you might have think that you've covered something that was really important, but they might have like missed it. So basically like make it as easy for the judge as possible to give you points, if that makes sense. And then also, so we did use like Quizlets, but we also used some online resources. So like something we did, we like right before the role play, we looked up like list of business like buzzwords. And then we try to incorporate some of those into our role plays just to sound more professional. Like if there's any like maybe common words that are less formal that you can replace with business terms, I would do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Always having some sort of like business jargon or, like models, theories, like those kind of things that you would expect to see in like a super formal business presentation. Like just think about those and try to incorporate them. Do you think there's anything else that like made you like that set you apart from others in terms of prepping for it? Like, did you study anything specifically that helped you do better?
Hmm. Yeah, I think what probably mostly helped us was like I think we approached the role play with like an attitude of like trying to have fun. So like I think the execution is just as important as the like studying, right? So like when approaching the judge's table, we like came up with like a backstory of like we really tried to get into the role. If it was like you're stumbling into the meeting late, we would come up with some sort of backstory of like what we were doing beforehand. And then for our final role play, we actually like we had some extra time during prep, so we folded like origami coffee cups and gave the judge one of them and was like, oh yeah, if you want some coffee, hopefully that'll like wake you up for the meeting. But also like the role play is like 15 minutes, right? And I think that's a lot of time. So I think you shouldn't rush into it. You should really like try to get the judge to like you because that's just as important as like actually doing well. Because ultimately there's going to be bias when it comes to scoring. So I think we approached it with like a pretty calm attitude and we tried to like build some rapport with the judge before just diving into it. I think it's really easy to get like overwhelmed by the timing and also the atmosphere is just like a bit nerve-wracking. So I think like calming yourself down beforehand and trying to have fun with it is a good idea.
All right, well that's so now we're gonna go on to role play and especially how we prep for them. I know that you're in team decision making, so you all had around 30 minutes to prepare, but it obviously would differ from like individual series and principals who only have 10. But with your experiences, what was the sort of structure of your prep time in terms of planning out, making ideas, connecting them to your PIs? How do you use those 30 minutes?
Yeah, so naturally 30 minutes is a lot more than 10 minutes, and you also have two people. So I will say that I think the expectations are a lot higher for what you come out with, right? So
Mhm.
I guess a bit of context, since I also did an individual team decision-making event, I think I spent those 10 minutes like frantically trying to piece together everything and have like being able to touch on every PI. But I think if you're doing a team decision event, right, I guess this obviously depends on how much time you get for yours, but you have a lot of luxury on how to spend your time. So I guess the time breakdown, you obviously start with reading the like prompt. I think we spent like 5 minutes reading it closely. And then one thing we tried to do for every role play is we wanted to do more than just like have like a verbal case for our judge. So we also spent time doing like 3 to 5 visuals on paper. And since my partner was like a lot better than drawing than I was, we usually like split it up. Like I would come up with some ideas for like visuals or exhibits we could present to the judge, and my partner would draw and create them and actually try spend like a lot of time trying to make them look nice. Because 30 minutes is a lot of time, right? And then other than that, I think the first thing that I do after like breaking down the prompt of the role play is just going through each PI and figuring out how we're going to connect it. And then we also come up with like, I guess like a roadmap, sort of to speak, where we like first we're going to touch on this, second we're going to touch on this, third we're going to touch on this, and we write it down on a piece of paper. I think like writing out your plan is probably not necessary for a lot of people, but it felt a lot easier for me personally because I think it's easy to get lost in your thoughts over the course of like 15 minutes or 30 minutes of prep time. So I'd write out like at least some sort of like bullet point plan of what you want to achieve with like each part of your presentation. Um, I think that splitting up the time with your partner is pretty important because while 30 minutes is a lot of time, it also goes by pretty quickly. So like figuring out what you're each best at. For example, like if you like know one part of the like event really well and your partner knows another part, I think it's fine to like split up the PIs that way as long as you figure out how to tie it cohesively together.
Okay,
Oh, and then
that's
also if you have extra time, it's always a good idea to like rehearse. Because sometimes like words don't come out the way you want them to. Right?
oh yeah, definitely rehearsing as well. It's for y'all. Do y'all also like rehearse when y'all were walking in between? Y'all would walk as slow as possible.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. All right, so we did talk. We kind of gave us a lot of insights about the collaboration, about how you and your partner collaborated. Was it morely like y'all just talking to each other the whole time? So it's like a collaborative based effort on creating your ideas together, or would y'all discuss for a few minutes and go do your own thing, then come back to make sure everyone was on the same page?
Mm, so I think, yeah, it was like a balance between like splitting up work and working together. I think it kind of just depended on the role play. Like for some of them, we immediately had an idea of like how to wow the judge. Um, so like we would split up into like a couple of visuals. We would try to like create graphs no matter what the problem was. So
Mhm.
it looked like we had a really comprehensive plan to the judge, right? Um, but I think like in general, I think cohesion between partners, if you're doing a team event, is really important because it just looks really bad if you like say something and your partner is like, oh wait, I thought I was supposed to say that. Like even if it's like non-verbal, right? Like it's very obvious
Yeah.
when you're hesitating or confused. And I also think it's really bad when one partner dominates. Like I think you should get pretty close to 50% talking as possible because it just looks like really bad. And I think it's also like not good in terms of collaboration with your partner. So if you can, I would like split up the roles equally. So I think while we split up a lot of the like individual tasks, I think most of the time, like definitely more than half the time, we were working together to figure out like how we would collaborate and like the order in which we would talk even. Just because I think a lot of those things are easy to forget when you actually start.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So then also with these 30 minutes, I heard the coffee idea. That was pretty cool. But what other types of flair would y'all have? I mean, we're getting sick and tired of just business cards now. Everyone does them from our area.
Yeah. Sorry, did you say flair?
Yeah, flair. Like, how do you spice it up a little bit? You can't just come with a presentation, right?
Yeah. So personally, I think it was probably like a bit of humor and anecdotes. So I want to come up with an example, but I don't remember exactly what we did. I think sometimes like part of the role play, like sometimes the situation is just a little bit absurd, right? And I think you can take like a risk and make a little bit fun of the situation if it seems like it's a good idea to, right? But I also think that like I think that when it comes to flair, it doesn't necessarily need to be humor. I think it really depends on like what you and your partner vibe with. I think humor is like it needs to come off like as natural, and the judge really needs to like vibe with you on that day, right? So I
Mhm.
think when it comes to flair, mm, I think that a lot of the small things that people do that they think matter, like making jokes or like coming up with like a really cool exit sentence, don't matter that much compared to like solid execution throughout. So I would say like if humor is not your thing, and you can't like come up with like an exciting entrance or exit, don't spend your time on that and don't force it. I think like just performing solidly throughout, having like good public speaking, good cadence, all of that is enough to like get you a really good score as well. So I think like spend a little bit of time. I think what we did was we spent like a couple minutes thinking of like if we could create anything cool for the situation. And if not, you just roll with the rest of the presentation and it doesn't really matter.
Okay, yeah, that makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense. So then in terms of papers, then did y'all give out a lot of handouts like with like graphs, lists of ideas? Like sometimes people give out like 10 pages and it works out very well for them. Sometimes they give out zero and it works out very well. So
Yeah, so I think usually we did try to give stuff to the judge just because it was easier to follow. So we didn't do this for the first role play, I think, but we made like a piece of paper titled like today's agenda, and then we would like give bullet points as to like the things that we were going to talk about in order and actually hand it to the judge, pretending like we were in an actual meeting, which not probably helps them like follow along. And it's also like a cool little gag. And it also helps us like organize. So that was one thing we did. Um, hmm. And then we also like, yeah, like I said, we try to give like a couple of handouts every role play. So we titled them like Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and we were like at like a specific point in the role play, we'd be like, okay, yeah, now like if you can turn your eyes to like Exhibit B, we have a graph of like the current profit versus the like expected profit breakdown if you follow our plan or something like that. And it's even fine to come up with like fake numbers for the current profit, current like return on investment, just to show that like you can do the math or just to like make it seem more realistic. I think it's fine to come up with like fake numbers if that makes sense in those situations. And like I think you definitely don't have to give out handouts. I think our style was just to like make them because it seemed like a good use of our 30 minutes. But like I'm like you can definitely succeed without making handouts to give to the judge. Like you said, a lot of people's style is to not pass anything out and just engage them verbally, which probably works really nicely too.
okay, so yeah, we're probably gonna go into like actual roleplay tips from Josephine. Thanks for the prep advice.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for everything that you've said so far. And just a kind of overview of what your role play looked like, did you follow any sort of like structure that you guys kind of had pre-planned before, or just like a general way of going and utilizing those 15 minutes you had?
Yeah, so I think like 1 minute introduction, maybe like a couple minutes for I forgot, are questions included in the 15 minutes? I think they are, right? Like if there's time left, the judge would ask you questions. So we
Yes.
left like we tried to leave 2 to 3 minutes for that. But for us, I don't think there was a timer available, so we couldn't pace it that well during the actual thing. We just tried to make sure that like time was split equally among the PIs or like relatively equally. Some of them might seem more important. But we mostly paced through that rather than having like an intro, um, a middle, and a conclusion. And then I think we also adapted to like what our judge looked like they were thinking. Like if they looked like they were bored or if they weren't really giving us like positive feedback. Like I think when you're speaking, people give you a lot of like feedback that's nonverbal, right? Like head nodding, like auditory sounds that are like approval. And I think once the judge stops doing that, sometimes it's like, okay, maybe we've talked enough about this PI and it's time to move on. So we didn't really have like a concrete timing structure, and we more of just like went with the flow. And then sometimes like we would communicate under the table by kicking each other if we thought the other person was talking for too long. So things like that, just like being able to improvise on the fly.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. I do an individual series, so I can't really be kicking anyone.
Oh yeah,
But
you could
when
kick the judge. But
yeah, I could try that out. For whenever you were talking about your performance indicators and stuff, I know that you also have to kind of introduce a sort of plan of action or a result, like a solution to your problem. So did you find that kind of allocating a specific amount of time to explain that work better, or did you kind of try to incorporate your performance indicators throughout while like having this overall sort of analogy for your resolution?
yeah, I think that's a pretty good question. I think usually we try to weave it in throughout. So if I can think of an example, I think there's one example that was like, so the role plays for our event are really weird, but one of them was like, your company hosts an annual 5K run that's like this fundraiser, but some employees feel really left out because like they're not fit enough to finish the run. And then it was like come up with a plan. So we came up with like a cool acronym, and then we came up with like a pyramid drawing with like different tiers of rewards depending on how far you could finish. So one of them was like just for showing up, you get a reward rather than having to like physically finish the race. And then another one was like you could raise money instead of like finishing the race yourself to raise money. So we just had this like overarching like either like a drawing or a visual or an analogy. So in this case, it was like a pyramid with like a slogan along with it. I forgot what it was. But then like walking through that visual and analogy, like we would try to hit on the PIs. Um, but usually like some of the PIs are like very general or broad, like they're kind of about the situation as a whole rather than like a specific part of it. So I think it's like perfectly fine to explain those separately too if you feel like you can't hit on them very well specific on their own.
Okay, and I see Uma has a question.
Oh.
If you
Yeah, sure. I just had another question. For just out of curiosity, have you ever had like a judge who didn't give you any facial cues or anything and just stared at you poker face through the entire role play? And
Yeah,
like,
definitely. Yeah.
okay, and so like, how did you handle that? You know, how did you still manage to interact with the judge? Any tips?
So I think throughout the role play we did like ask the judge questions sometimes just to get their feedback. Like, what do you think about this? Or like, does that sound good to you? Like, even if it's like a pretty rhetorical question, like if you ask them a question, they're probably gonna respond, even if they're like the poker face type of judge. But I think some judges are also informed to like I had one of my judges say like they weren't allowed to react to anything because it'd be like unprofessional and unfair or something, and they weren't supposed to give us like any hints. So I think also just keep in mind that some judges like this is just how they act when they're like professional and they're not trying to be mean or they're not like thinking that you're talking too long. This is just like what they think they should be looking like when they're listening to a presentation.
Yeah, that's great advice. Like keeping the judge engaged if you're not able to get facial cues, ask questions, things like that. Because it makes them listen, right? If they have kind of drifted away, it makes them come back. And then the
Yeah.
other thing I had was how do you make sure that you keep your role play? As you mentioned, like there is no clock in front of you. How do you make sure that you keep your role play short enough to fit within the time and still have time for questions? I know for like PBMs and individual series, or individual series in particular, you're fitting in like many performance indicators in just 10 minutes. So how do you make sure that you have that time, and how do you do kind of time management in that role play scenario?
Yeah. I think if you've practiced enough or if you've like done a lot of other competitions or events where you need like 10 to 15 minutes, I think you kind of get a sense of how long 10 to 15 minutes is. Um, but also I will say that like I think not having enough time for questions is not necessarily going to end your role play or be super bad for you if you're able to cover everything comprehensively, right? Like we use the questions are not very interesting and like half the time we already answered them before in the presentation. So if you do get questions, that's a good opportunity to use those. That's basically like saying you have 2 to 5 minutes left. Is there anything like you feel like you didn't go hard enough on or anything that you missed? And you kind of just incorporate that into the question because the questions are usually like super broad. Like you can probably explain any of the PIs while answering that question. So like the questions are a good opportunity to convince the judge that like you know what you're talking about in terms of like one specific area. But if you don't get the questions, it's also fine. Um, it's probably a bad idea to like miss out entirely on a couple of PIs and then you completely run out of time. So I think we went by the idea that like going faster is better than going slower. When you're nervous, like you typically tend to talk faster anyway. So I think it's like fine to have a few minutes left for questions and then just use that time to kind of make up what you didn't get to if you had more things you wanted to say. But like try not to miss any of the things that you needed to say for sure.
That sounds good. Also, on the topic of hitting your performance indicators, did you find that it was more productive to kind of just like go down through all of them, or did you kind of just try to like answer a little bit of one here and then like come back to it later?
Yeah. So I guess like we were pretty scared that the judge would just like miss because it's like after the role play they start to score you and the
Mhm.
PIs are like kind of broad sometimes so we were scared that like they would miss our explanation or just like have to think to themselves like whether or not we covered it. So I think sometimes, like I said earlier, we would like specifically repeat wording from the performance indicator or go really slow when we were saying that. Not like obnoxiously slow, but like a little bit slower and just emphasize that like we were kind of moving on to this performance indicator. Um, Personally for us, like it worked better to just cover each one individually rather than like doing like a little bit of one and then coming back to it. We tried to make clear what like every part of our which PI every part of our presentation was supposed to be answering, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And I also did just like wondering whenever you answer these performance indicators, how you kind of went about to actually answer them. Because I know there's like, I think 18 points that they could give you for. So what did you find was like the best to actually give like the most holistic answer?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think let me see if I can pull up like a
Yeah.
sample PI
Okay.
list.
I guess like I was just thinking because whenever I do them, I a lot of the time I get PIs that are like literally the same thing. So I
Yeah.
try to like define them first and then like connect it back to my story. But sometimes even with that, it's still a little bit bland. So I was wondering if you had any tips on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think like yeah, so we wouldn't just be like this is performance indicator one and this is like what how we relate to that. I think it was usually like we were talking about a specific thing and then we'd be like, so this is sort of how we would comply with the spirit and intent of laws and regulations and we think that's really important at your firm because so we would like explicitly say the PI, I guess, but also like give a bit of freedom to address them if that makes sense. I think like most of the time, if you say specific terms in the PI or make it clear that you're addressing that PI, and then just say things that are related to that PI, like the judge is going to be like super convinced that you know where that you know what you're talking about in like with respect to that performance indicator.
Okay, I see that. That's really good. And if you find the questions, just feel free to like interrupt me and talk about that. But I also did, I know you mentioned it earlier about public speaking and how that really like your delivery matters a lot. Do you have any specific tips on how you kind of like matched your partner speaking or just in general how you guys really try to like make it as smooth delivery as possible?
Yeah, yeah. So this is actually like a component of the role play that we spent a lot of time thinking about just like talking speed in general because me and my partner like I think we both tend to talk pretty quickly and judges have commented on that in the past. So I think like for us at least we explicitly tried to slow down and then if the other person was either talking too fast or like going too quickly through the PI obviously you shouldn't like call them out during the middle of the presentation. So if I thought my partner didn't cover a point like adequately enough, I would like try to repeat it more clearly, but like not exactly the same words. So it wouldn't feel like it was repeating, but try to like add on to that. And then my partner would also do that for me. So I think it's just like how do you cover for each other without making it obvious that like you made a mistake or something like that. Yeah, I think like your cadence and your speed is super important. Like it's super important to both like sound confident to the judge and then also just sound professional in general, but also like certain inflections of your voice just make it a lot easier for someone to listen to what you're saying, right? Like I think definitely everyone talks in a different way, but there are certain like tones that you can use that just make it a lot easier to listen to what you're saying, versus like being able to tune it out really easily for the judge.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just for like the people who get really nervous, I know I get really nervous before I do like public speaking and stuff. Do you have any tips on how you handle that?
Yeah, I think number one is just practice. So between my like first and second year, I had a lot of practice in public speaking because I went on like my school student government, so I had to like talk in front of assemblies a lot. So that definitely helped. The second thing is just like also something I said earlier, just like try to have fun with it. Like think of it as more than just like a competition. Think of it as like you're kind of acting like a part, right? So it's like it should be something that's like a little bit fun. And then third is just like I guess try to relax a little bit before the role play. We ended up like making friends with like a team from Michigan and just like having small talk with them while we were sitting in the chairs like before getting ready to line up and walk to the judges table. So just things like that I think can help calm you down. But I think mostly it just comes down to like how much practice you have with public speaking.
Okay. Okay, those are some really good points. Also, just on like the topic of speaking and fluidity in general, I know you get to bring in like your preparation and paper that you have with you and you can write
Mhm.
whatever notes you want it. But I was
Mhm.
wondering if you have like any tips on how you kind of go about to look at your paper without being really awkward and being like, hold on a minute, and like looking down and be like, yeah, so economics as business supplies actually this or something like that. Or how do you kind of approach your paper and like insert it organically into your speeches?
Yeah, so I think this probably applies more to like team decision-making events, but the benefit of having two people is that you only need to be talking for half of the time, and the other half of the time you can be listening to your partner and thinking about how to tie in what you want to say with what they want to say, right? So we had like an opening planned. Sometimes we would write down like exactly what we wanted our first sentence to be, just because it's easy to forget. But after that, we kind of just took turns, and you really want to you so even when you're not the person talking, I think it's pretty important to listen to what your partner is saying, just so you can make sure the transition is smooth. I will say that I guess if you're doing an individual event, it's a lot more important to be able to like improvise and make it sound natural without like you said, looking at your paper repeatedly and trying to figure out what you're saying next. I think if you're individual, you probably have to accept that like any plan you come up with, you'll probably deviate from and still try to cover everything regardless.
Okay, yeah, I see. That makes a lot of sense. And I just thought of this one more question that has to do with PIs and stuff. Whenever you're hitting them, do you find it better to like explicitly say like, oh, like now that we're addressing how to approach customer service, I think it's really important to like really explain what a customer service mindset is? Or did you find it was more important to say something like, um, now on the topic of like addressing our customers' clients, we really had to think about what a customer servant mindset would look like, or like how did you differentiate whether you wanted to just like kind of break that fourth wall or kind of try to incorporate it within your speech?
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly what we did. We might have like actually said the words like performance indicator, like moving on
Oh,
to
okay.
but I'm not sure if we did that. It might be better to like contextualize it. So like I think your second example is pretty good. Like use the wording of the performance indicator, but like start your own sentence or like keep the role play going, but make sure you hit the words of the performance indicator. Because I think the thing is like the PIs are like honestly like pretty broad and some of them like are a little bit silly. Like some of them you look at them and you're like, why is this not included in the other one and why do I have to hit it specifically? Um, and I think most judges when grading you, like they're gonna have common sense too. Like they're probably just gonna think back to your presentation and be like, yeah, I think they touched on this, and then just give you like a pretty high score. So I think like you should just try your best to like specifically address each one, but also it's fine if they like don't know like exactly what performance indicator you're hitting if they know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, that does make sense. And whenever like you know how they grade you after the performance and I mean the time is up. So that means that they probably don't like remember specifically everything you said. Do you think there's any like tips that you had or something you tried to say just to kind of ensure like you hit those beyond expectation marks versus just like meets expectations or below expectations?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the reasons we gave a lot of like visuals and paper resources, just because they keep those after the role play, or I'm pretty sure they keep those after the role play because we leave it on their desk. So it's something for them to refer back to. And it's also why we like made like a roadmap so they could like think back to like, oh yeah, this is when they covered that. And then I also think this kind of goes for like public speaking in general, or like if you do debate, but like I think having like a way to like condense your argument into like a short amount of time at the end, like 30 seconds to 1 minute, and just give the judge like a big picture of everything you talked about. And usually that's like enough to incorporate all of the PIs, even if it's not super specific. Like just give them the big picture at the end and make sure they understand it. So I think it's fine to like deviate from business language to make sure that they understand the like core point of what you're getting to, if that's what you need at the end.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And also, have you ever like encountered a role play wherever you didn't actually know the quote like correct answer or definition of a performance indicator and how you went about that?
Okay, I think this like probably doesn't really apply to my event because the PIs are like I think pretty easy to understand. Most of the time it's about either emotional intelligence or like a couple of types of law. So like the difference between like tort and criminal, and then the difference between like intellectual like property and like something else, like what counts as plagiarism. Um, so I think for us there were only like a couple of technical things that could show up. Um, if it's for like a different event where like you actually don't know what a term in a PI means, um, hmm, I think you should just try your best to sound like you know what you're saying. I think
Yeah.
you should just bluff your way through the PI.
Okay, that makes sense because I
Yeah.
always tell people like there's no wrong answer as long as you like say what it is and even if it's not actually what it is, as long as you kind of like come up with your own definition, it would be better than not. So I was just wondering if you had anything on that.
Yeah, I would say like definitely don't just skip over it because I think even like in the real world, a big part of business is being able to convince other people that you know what you're talking about, even if you don't always. And I think like DECA kind of encapsulates that really well because I think if you're doing a role play right, it'll feel like sometimes you're going over the top or sometimes you're like overplaying a character. And I think that's a good thing because I think you can like sound really professional and sound like you know what you're saying. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. And my final question is, I know you already talked about it, about answering the questions that the judge gives you at the end. How did you guys like really go about answering those questions, especially if like it kind of threw you off guard and seemed like it came out of nowhere?
Yeah. So yeah, some of the questions are pretty weird sometimes. And other times like it's a question that you've already answered. So I don't know like how DECA comes up with the questions, but I know that judges have like a list of questions to ask if there's extra time. I think so judges are going to ask you the question even if they feel like you've already covered it, because I think they're supposed to ask from a specific list. So I think if it's something you've already covered before, you can try to like nicely tie in your previous discussion and just elaborate with a few more sentences. And then if it's something that like kind of throws you off guard or like you don't really know how to address, I would just try to like bring it back to what you know and what you've talked about as quickly as possible, right? Like the same idea of like make sure you sound like you know what you're doing. So just like address the question and then sort of like with every sentence, like bring it back to what you're comfortable with and then bring it back to like the PIs. Because there's a couple like there's some points on the like actual role play for like presentation, collaboration, like 21st century skills, right? But most of it is just scoring on the PIs and there's no score for how well you answer questions, right? That's kind of like holistically built in into everything else. So I would just try to maintain the previous tenets, right? Like maintain good public speaking, make sure you know what you're talking about. Other than that, if you don't answer a question super well, I don't think it's gonna affect you much if you already covered everything you needed to.
Okay, that is really good. And before I go, one more question for you. If you had to summarize every single role play you did and everything you try to like really keep in mind when you did one, what are 3 words that you would use to encapsulate this entire experience?
3 words.
Like,
Okay.
what are 3 focus words that you always bring into every single role play that you do?
Yeah, I think first probably collaboration. Like you want to build a sense that you and your partner are like if the role play asks you to, like you want to build a sense that you and your partner are actually co-workers or like you are actually their manager or something. Second is probably just like professionalism. It's like a bit cliche, but I think it's important to just like be polite, be like healthily assertive, and then also just like smile, right? Know what you're talking about, make eye contact with your partner and the judge. Don't like try not to like doze off. Um, and then third for me is probably humor. Like try to insert humor or not necessarily even humor. Like humor doesn't have to be like a joke, like just some sort of like lighthearted remark to like break the tension if you feel like the conversation is too serious. Yeah.
Okay, that's a really good answer, and I'll leave the rest up to Arnav now. Thank you.
Okay, so we're finally reached the end. We're finally reaching the conclusion. Thank you for staying with us for so long. Thank you for answering so many questions. I
Yeah, of course.
honestly, yeah, I honestly only have one question for you, so let's try to make it an important question. My main question to you is, what is your final like general tips, and what are your like secret final techniques? Like, what can you give us? What first place magical techniques can you give Westwood ICDC qualifiers in order to achieve utmost success? Like anything.
Yeah, I think you should think of DECA as more of an improv event than a business event, especially if you're doing a role play, right? If you're doing a written, it's probably different because you have like a specific thing you're turning in. But if you're doing a role play, I think you should think of it as an improv event. You should know the business knowledge, but once you get to the judges table, the ball is like kind of in your court, and you need to be able to like improvise and react to unexpected things. So I don't know if this was at ICDC, I hope not. But one of my role plays, I think instead of giving us 30 minutes, they accidentally set the clock to 10 minutes. And then like everyone in my group was just like, what is happening? But then they made us go anyway, and I don't think anyone ever told the judge. So we only had 10 minutes to prepare that time. So we had like a very hastily put together presentation. But we kind of just went with the flow. And I don't know how well we did on that specific role play, but those are just like hopefully unlikely, but possible situations that you just have to be ready for, right? At the end of the day, like DECA is supposed to be fun, and I think it's mostly supposed to be an event to help you hone your like ability to publicly speak and also improvise, like I said. So you should think of it as like more of those things than like a super serious business event, because I think it's important to like lighten up when you're with the judge. You can remain professional while also seeming like a kind and like happy person to talk to.
Okay, that sounds good. Now I think we're going to be handing off questions, just the last few questions to the audience, not the audience, but you know the people who are not panel members. So I'm pretty sure that we Zoom has like a raise hand thing. So if you can just raise a hand, and then we can like you can ask your question.
Yeah, before you do that, actually, I think I'll start it off with just one thing. Oh, and I know you told me so much at math camp. You're like, you just like randomly went into ICDC and you just won. But I feel like
Oh
it's
yeah.
like your smartness combined with like this relaxed attitude, that's really magical and that's really amazing. So thanks for sharing all of that stuff. But I do want to ask a more technical question about the content that you say.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
when you're looking at the performance indicators, right? Do you do you do you focus on answering them like the conventional way, or do you try to be like, I try to think of like as creative of an idea as possible, or do you take like a balance?
I think like low key, I think we just try to answer it as like direct as possible. I think this is just like I think we were mostly like scared that the judge was gonna miss what we were talking about. And maybe like I don't think we executed like perfectly, right? So I think there's probably a lot of room for creativity in terms of how you answer the PIs. We just like personally didn't incorporate much of that. We just try to answer as direct as possible. I think we were also like scared that like too much like creativity would be like too quirky and like too annoying. But I think if you find the like right balance, you can definitely answer it in a way that's like not how people typically answer it. But that was just like a bit difficult for us to envision.
Awesome. Yeah, okay. At this point, if any of the audience members, if y'all have any questions, feel free to just unmute or raise your hand, and we have a few more minutes for questions. And these can be anything, any complete question.
I saw Neev Gupta raised their hand. You saw that question or?
Oh yeah, I think my hand went down on accident. I just had a quick question. So how do you sort of, it's kind of answered in the last question, but how do you go about like straying away from like the solution that every single other person has? Like obviously if you have I'm in your event, but like if we have a question that would be like, I don't know, these two employees are fighting, and you don't want to have that same solution where you just say, oh, put them into HR and then like sort of deal with their problem. How do you like sort of come about bring that solution to like a unique point so that your judge almost like remembers yours?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think you said you're in my event, right? I think for like business law and team decision making, maybe this is true for other deck events, but a lot of it just feels obvious. Like I think most teams are going to reach a similar conclusion. But like for the like example role play that you asked, right? Like let's say two people are fighting. Like I wouldn't necessarily say you have to come up with a super creative solution, like make them like box it out or something. Like I think sometimes you just stick to like what makes sense, right? Like what's actually going to happen in a business. They're probably going to be sent to HR. But what me and my partner would do is we'd probably come up with like a 4-step solution and then like turn it into like a cool acronym and then like have like a story for each step. So maybe first is like talk it out. And then like at the end they have to make like a performance improvement plan for themselves in the future. I think like it's not bad to stick to what works and what makes logical sense because some questions there's only one like route that you can go that makes sense, but there's like different ways that you can tell that story if it makes sense.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, if no one else has any, I have a few more questions. Hold on. So first of all, like back to the topic of visuals. You said you made like 3 to 5 visuals for your role play and you made graphs. What kind of other visuals did you make apart from your agenda and your graphs? And then also, what kind of keywords or phrases or topics helped you decide what type of visuals to make in your role play?
I think we just like we made visuals based on what like idea we came up with at the time, right? So like for one thing we had like if it sometimes it just makes sense. So one of them we made like a pyramid with like different like tiers of rewards, like I said, for the 5K run. And that just made sense for that specific scenario. And then we like branded it and came up with a name. And then in terms of graphs, like I would say stick to like what's like sort of necessary. So we would like compare the previous profit with the new profit or compare like something else, but like only do it when you have like an actual metric to compare. So I think visuals are good, but like maybe don't go overboard. In terms of deciding like what other visuals to do, I think sometimes we also did like tables if your problem like involves numbers at all. But and then I think sometimes we like if it asked us to come up with like a specific campaign or like idea, we would come up with like a slogan or a mascot or like some sort of branding for that and draw it out if we had time to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So on like that topic for the agenda that you would make. So I also do agendas in my role plays, but I keep them kind of short and just I kind of literally write out the wording of the performance indicators for my agendas. So I was wondering if that's something you do as well, or if you change up the wording in your agenda, and make it more specific to your plan. And also like if you add in more of the specific points that you talk about, like within the agenda as well.
Yeah. So pretty much like, yeah, I think pretty much what we did is pretty similar to you. The agenda shouldn't be long. It should be easy to follow and read. I wouldn't say we wrote down the PIs like one by one. Probably like a couple bullet points is enough. we probably tailored it more to like what we were actually going to present rather than the PIs. Just because they already have access to the PIs and we would hit on them later.
Makes sense. Okay. Also on that note, I know you said you tried to keep it pretty like you do one at a time for the PIs, but did you make sure that you kept them in order of the list that you got, or did you adjust that order if it made more sense with your plan or something like that? Which one did you prioritize, I guess?
You mean like adjusting the order of the PIs?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine to go out of order. I think sometimes it doesn't make sense to adjust them in order. And I think it's fine as long as you make it clear to the judge. Yeah, I
Okay,
don't
one
think it
last.
has to be in order.
Okay, cool. One last thing was, let's say we're going back to what Josie asked earlier, like if you don't know something, like for example, a vocab term, or like you don't know the technical answer they're looking for. I know you said like try to make it seem like you know what you're talking about. Would you recommend like kind of talking about that exact thing and making something up, while pretending you knew what you were talking about? Or would you recommend talking about something related that you know well and tying it back? Like which
Oh,
route would you go?
yeah, sorry. Sorry if I was unclear earlier. Definitely don't make anything up. Like, don't say anything that's
Yeah.
like blatantly false. Like, oh, this term means that. I think like what you said second makes a lot of sense. Like, try to talk about. I think it's unlikely you'll hear a term that like you're completely unfamiliar with. More of like maybe you don't know exactly what it means. I think just talk about things that are similar to that, and maybe repeat the word a couple of times in between. Like, make it sound like you're talking about the thing, but definitely don't say like anything that's false. Just try to bring it back to things you're more comfortable with discussing. Yeah.
That sounds
Awesome.
good. Does
Yeah.
anyone else have questions?
Wait, I do have one for all the TDM people because I know DECA, I don't know if it's the same at your school, but at our school, it's kind of infamous for like tearing apart friendships. So I was wondering if you had any tips on, keeping that good energy going between you and your friends and like, splitting up the time whenever you talk and whenever you plan. Because I know everyone like has partner beef at some point. So I was wondering how you approach that.
Um, I guess the situation was like a bit different for me and my partner because it was her first year. So like we didn't really have expectations going in. So I guess we weren't very competitive. So I don't think we actually ran into like any issues for that season. Um, So, like partner dynamic. Yeah, I think like it's important to make like outside of the in-round stuff, I think you need to like make clear what your expectations are for DECA. I know a lot of people at our school like they had different expectations for like time commitment, things like that, and I think those are really important to like talk about before you get into the season, I guess. Yeah.
Awesome. Anyone else have any other questions? All right. If not, then that'll be a wrap for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Owen, so much for doing this. It's a great help, and I'm sure it'll benefit a lot of our Westwood DECA members. So,
Yeah, of course.
yeah. Other than that, okay, we're done. Have a great day, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, Owen.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Yep.
you so much.
For your time.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye guys.
Bye.